All right, let's dive right into this explainer. We're going to see how archaeology actually pieces together the daily lives and spiritual habits of the ancient Israelites. We often read ancient texts like the Hebrew Bible and kind of picture a world a lot like our own, just older. But honestly, grounding these ancient stories in the actual dirt, the pottery, and the architecture of the time completely flips our understanding upside down. Today, we're unpacking the findings of Dr. Jonathan Greer, exploring the deeply rooted cultural context of ancient Israel.
So here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the struggle for survival, move on to ancient industry and innovation, then the reality of religion. After that, we'll unearth the ancient altar, ask the question, Yahweh and his Asherah, and wrap up with the invisible king.
Okay, so to really get ancient Israelite society, you absolutely have to grasp this concept of the patrimonial household model. This definitely wasn't a society of isolated, independent individuals. It was intensely communal and hierarchical. At the very micro level, you had the house of the father, this bounded household with a central male figure, his kids, and extended family. And this structure literally dictated how they built their houses. From there, the social fabric expanded outward, right? To the clan, then to the entire tribe, and eventually reaching all the way to the very top of the social pyramid.
Now, what's really fascinating here is how the deity and the human king precariously share that very top tier. In the ancient Israelite mind, Yahweh was at the absolute apex of this patrimonial structure. But when Israel actually instituted a human monarchy, it created a massive tension. Think about it. If God is the ultimate head of the household, where on earth does a human king fit into the picture? This push and pull between the earthly kingdom and the divine ruler is a dynamic we see playing out over and over again throughout biblical scripture.
Which brings us to part 1, the struggle for survival, daily life in the ancient Levant.
Before we can even touch on kings and grand temples, we really have to talk about basic survival. Because for the average ancient Israelite, practically your entire day was eaten up just trying to get food and, most importantly, water. In our modern world, we just turn on a tap, so it's kind of hard to appreciate. But back then, finding water was a constant, exhausting grind. They relied heavily on trapping rainwater in hand-dug cisterns. Picture the murky, green, stagnant water sitting at the bottom of an ancient cistern. When the prophet Jeremiah criticizes the Israelites for trading living water, fresh flowing spring water, for broken cisterns that leak and just hold that kind of gross, stagnant stuff, he's tapping into a viscerally relatable hardship. It's a powerful metaphor, but it is totally rooted in their grueling physical reality. Moving on to part 2, ancient industry and innovation. Let's look at foodways and technology.
Once we look past mere survival, we actually find some incredible evidence of their industriousness. These folks weren't just scraping by, they were developing some pretty complex agricultural tech. From pressing olives for oil and cosmetics to running industrial-level apiaries for honey over at sites like Tel Rehof. And the absolute cornerstone of their diet? Bread. If you break down the steps, it perfectly captures the intense, literal back-breaking labor required just to make your daily loaf. You had to plant the grain, harvest it by hand with flint sickles, drag a massive threshing sledge over the stalks, toss it up in the air so the wind could blow away the chaff, manually grind it down on a heavy stone saddle, and finally bake that sourdough in a scorching hot tabboon oven. Knowing all this gives so much physical weight to the bread and harvesting metaphors used by prophets like Amos. Bread wasn't a quick trip to the store, it was a full-time job. And digging into the zoo archaeology data gives us a really clear picture of what else was actually on the menu. While hunting definitely happened, the animal bone records show a massive reliance on domestic sheep, goats, and cattle. We find way less evidence of wild game like gazelles and almost zero evidence of pigs or beasts of burden like donkeys being eaten. So all this data paints a rock-solid picture of a heavily pastoral agricultural diet.
All right, part 3, the reality of religion. Practice versus belief.
Okay, shifting gears from physical survival to spiritual life, we hit a really complex reality down in the dirt. When archaeologists excavate ancient Israel, they uncover tons of evidence showing that the general population wasn't just worshiping Yahweh alone, they were actually incorporating a whole mix of other deities into their lives. Now, rather than seeing these polytheistic finds as some huge contradiction to the Bible, we have to look at it impartially and realize that this archaeology perfectly backs up the biblical text. The biblical ideal of worshiping Yahweh alone is explicitly presented as the minority opinion. The prophets and the authors of Kings are constantly calling out the majority of the population for this exact type of blended worship that we keep digging up today.
So how do archaeologists actually know a site was used for religious purposes? Well, they rely on a whole constellation of data. It's like a giant puzzle. They're looking for specific deity icons, repeated patterns that hint at rituals, high concentrations of buried figurines, unique pits of animal bones, specifically right-sided bones that match up with priestly portions, and specialized vessels for burning incense. By piecing all these clues together, researchers can confidently pinpoint where and how ancient rituals went down, whether it was just a tiny corner of a room or a massive temple complex.
Let's jump to Part 4, Unearthing the Ancient Altar, Discoveries at Tel Dan.
Up at northern sites like Tel Dan, physical artifacts do an amazing job of bringing ancient texts right to life. Tel Dan actually features the reconstructed metal framework of what used to be a massive four-horned altar. But honestly, what they found right nearby is the truly astonishing part. In a small room called the Western Chambers, sitting right next to a smaller altar, archaeologists uncovered a cache of bronze items. And when you put these artifacts side by side with the priestly texts in the Bible that describe tabernacle or temple altar kits, the parallels are absolutely undeniable.
See, the biblical text outlines this highly specific, strictly regulated sacrificial system. It requires a blood bowl, a pair of de-ashing shovels, an ash pot, and a meat fork. And at Tel Dan, they found exactly that. They unearthed a beautiful bronze bowl, a matching pair of identical shovels, a sunken ceramic pot packed with burned animal remains, and a long metal handle sitting on the threshold. As archaeologists like to joke, that handle is exactly what you call a three-pronged fork, after its prongs have been broken off over a couple of millennia.
On to Part 5, Yahweh and his Asherah, Deciphering Ancient Inscriptions.
To kind of complicate our understanding of religious purity even further, we can look at the actual names these people left behind. One of the best tools we have is onomastic evidence, which is just the study of names. Specifically, we look at theophoric names. These are personal names that have a literal piece of a god's name embedded right into them. Because ancient deities were often tied to specific ethnic groups and areas, tracking these names acts like a cultural footprint. It helps us map out exactly which deities were being actively worshipped by everyday people across different times and places.
So, when you hear familiar biblical names like Jonathan, which in Hebrew is Yonatan, meaning Yahweh has given, or Hezekiah, which has that Yah element right in it, you are literally hearing the ancient integration of the divine name right into everyday identity. But here's the catch. Right alongside those Yahweh names, archaeologists also dig up names incorporating deities like Baal and Hadad, which just further proves how blended this religious environment really was.
And honestly, nowhere is this blending more visually striking than on the Ta'anach cult stand from the 9th century BC. As we walk down the physical registers of this artifact, a fascinating theological story unfolds. Right at the top, there's a sun disk over a calf, which is abstract imagery often tied to Yahweh in the Northern Kingdom. One register down, we see a sacred tree flanked by goats and lions, which is classic ancient Near Eastern imagery for a female deity. Below that, an empty space flanked by cherubs, again, a major nod to the invisible Yahweh. And on the very bottom, a female figure flanked by lions. Many scholars look at this undeniable, side-by-side setup as clear evidence of a localized blending of Yahuistic worship with a female deity, probably Asherah.
Which leads us to our final section, Part 6, The Invisible King, Israel Among the Nations.
To truly wrap our heads around ancient Israel, we have to zoom out and compare their worldview with their ancient Near Eastern neighbors. They definitely shared a ton of cultural DNA. We're talking sacrifices, sacred feasts, hymns, and temple priesthoods. But there was a radical difference right at the core. Take the Ahiram sarcophagus from Byblos, for example. It depicts a deceased human king sitting on a massive throne made of flanking cherubs, resting his feet on a footstool. Now, contrast that with the biblical description of the Holy of Holies in Solomon's temple. There you also have flanking cherubs making up a throne, and the Ark of the Covenant acting as the footstool. But the huge, absolutely crucial distinction, the throne is empty. It's aniconic. There's no human king or carved idol sitting there. It's just the furniture upon which an invisible deity resides.
Ultimately, this hits at the very heart of the ancient Israelite worldview. In the cultures all around them, the human king and the high priest were elevated as supreme, sometimes even divine figures tangled up in the national ideology. But in Israel, their radical distinction was that their ultimate ruler, the true head of that vast patrimonial household, was an invisible, personal God.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this to chew on. When you take these ancient texts and ground them in the dirt of the Levant, in the heavy stone grinders, the stagnant water cisterns, and the bronze shovels of reality, how does it transform your understanding of the past?
These aren't just abstract floating stories. They are deeply anchored in the sweat, the survival, and the messy religious struggles of real human beings. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive into our cultural history. Keep questioning, keep digging, and I'll catch you on the next one.